The town had been alive the night before. Streets humming with tourists, voices weaving in and out of one another, bars spilling laughter into the warm summer air, and neon lights drawing restless figures from one corner to the next. Ethan, Lucas, and Sarah had arrived late, dragging their luggage through cobblestone paths slick from the sea breeze, smiling at the thought of a weekend away from their grinding jobs. The hotel wasn't grand, but it had character. The receptionist smiled warmly as she handed them keys, and the sound of muffled music carried in from the street below. They laughed as they planned the next day: breakfast at the cafe across the square, then a walk to the shoreline, maybe a rented boat to explore the coves. The night closed around them easily, a cocoon of security built on the simple comfort of human presence. The world outside their window pulsed with life until exhaustion forced their eyes shut. When morning came, the silence was immediate, crushing, unnatural. Ethan woke first. He thought at first he had simply risen too early, catching the city before it stirred. But when he pulled aside the curtains, he froze. The square outside lay in perfect stillness. Cafe chairs scattered about, tables still set, a newspaper fluttering in the breeze like a bird's wing. Cars lined the street, doors unlocked, a bus idling near the corner, its lights faintly blinking. Yet there was no one. Not a single figure crossing the street, no chatter, no engines, no footsteps. Lucas stumbled out of bed soon after, rubbing his eyes, muttering something about coffee. His words stopped when he joined Ethan at the window. Sarah was next, her voice catching in her throat as she whispered, Where is everyone?" They went outside. The air was heavy, the kind of heat that should have been punctuated by laughter and conversation, but instead only magnified the emptiness. Their footsteps echoed too loudly, bouncing off the stone walls of the narrow street as if the buildings themselves were leaning in to listen. Doors stood ajar. A bakery still smelled of fresh bread, though no hands worked the ovens. A stroller sat abandoned on the curb. On a bench, a paperback book lay open, its pages rippling, as though the reader had only just set it down. The deeper they moved into the town, the more impossible it became. Entire plazas lay deserted, fountains trickling with water that seemed louder than it should have been. Shops were open, merchandise neatly arranged, radios faintly playing static. Not silence, no, silence would have been mercy. This was worse. This was a city left in motion, but stripped of its people. By noon, the weight of it pressed down on them. They gathered at the fountain in the town square, trying to rationalize. Maybe there had been an evacuation? A gas leak? Some kind of emergency? But no alarms had sounded, no sirens cut through the night. Their phones displayed nothing but dead signals, frozen maps that refused to update. Then Ethan saw it. At the far end of the street stood a figure. Black, unmoving, featureless against the pale light of day. At first, he thought it was a trick of the eyes, a shadow cast from one of the lamp posts. But no, the shape was wrong. It stood upright, elongated, its edges too sharp against the shimmering heat. He blinked. And in that blink, it vanished. His chest tightened. "Did you see that?" he asked, voice strained. "See what?" Sarah asked, following his gaze. "Nothing," Ethan lied, though his voice betrayed him. But Lucas caught the shift in his tone. His brows furrowed. "Don't start, man. Not here. Not now." The hours stretched. They moved from street to street, but the town was a labyrinth, each turn bringing them back to the same places. The bus still idled, though its engine no longer sounded. The cafe's tables remained untouched, glasses still half full of orange juice, a thin film forming at the top. As evening approached, a new sound threaded the silence. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, coming from behind them. They spun around, but the streets were empty. Still, the sound persisted, always just beyond reach, always behind. By nightfall, they had retreated to the hotel. The lobby was deserted, the keys still hanging neatly behind the counter. They locked themselves in their room, the three of them huddled together in the glow of a single lamp. Outside, the town seemed to shift. Windows flickered with faint light, as though unseen inhabitants had returned to their homes. Yet no silhouettes passed behind the curtains. No laughter. No sound but the hum of electricity. And then came the whisper. It started faint, like wind brushing against glass. Ethan leaned closer to the window, straining to hear. Words, soft, indistinct, threading through the night air. They didn't sound foreign, yet he could not place them. The voice didn't belong to one person. It was many, overlapping, weaving together in a chorus of absence. Sarah covered her ears, her breathing sharp. "Make it stop," she whispered, rocking slightly on the bed. Lucas clenched his fists, trying to project confidence. "It's nothing. Just the wind." Just, his words faltered. Because they all knew it wasn't the wind. The whispers thickened, pressing against the glass, circling the hotel like a tide. The lamp flickered. Ethan thought he saw movement outside, shadows stretching longer than they should, shapes shifting where no one stood. His heart pounded. The silence had broken, but what replaced it was worse. They did not sleep that night. When dawn bled across the sky, the whispers retreated, fading as though the light itself forced them back. But the relief was hollow. For as they stepped cautiously outside, they saw new evidence of change. On the walls of the nearest building, written in black streaks that dripped like blood, were words none of them had written. "We see you." The message on the wall bled into their minds long after they had turned away from it. "We see you." 3 words, crude, dripping, etched into stone as though the city itself had chosen to speak. Sarah trembled when she first read them. She refused to look again, her eyes darting instead to every other surface as if more words might suddenly appear. Lucas tried to laugh it off, though his voice cracked when he did. Ethan only stared, frozen, because he recognized the strokes. They weren't random smears, nor graffiti left behind. The letters bent inward, jagged, not written by a human hand but clawed into the wall. The town was no longer simply empty. It was aware. They moved together, keeping close, following the streets with increasing urgency. They thought perhaps they could find the edge of the city, some road leading out. Yet each street folded into another, and each turn brought them back to familiar corners. The fountain. The bus. All unchanged, as though trapped in repetition. By midday, exhaustion pressed on them. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, but food from the shops sat untouched, untrustworthy. Who had cooked it? Who had left it? Could it still be safe? They took bottled water from a store, though even that seemed stale, tasting faintly of metal. It was Lucas who saw the figure first this time. They had turned into an alleyway, its walls narrow, litter blowing in slow circles at their feet. At the far end, just before the alley opened into another square, a black silhouette stood waiting. Still sharp watch. "Jesus Christ," Lucas whispered, halting in his tracks. His words cracked against the walls, far too loud in the oppressive silence. Ethan's gaze followed, and there it was, taller now, or maybe closer. An outline without detail, its head tilted ever so slightly, as though studying them. He blinked once, and it was gone. Sarah backed against the wall, her breath ragged. "Did you see it too?" "Yes," Ethan admitted, though part of him wished to deny it. Lucas ran a hand through his hair, pacing, muttering curses under his breath. "This isn't real. This isn't possible." But it was real. Every fiber of their bodies screamed it. The town had become a stage, and they were its only performers, hunted by shadows that revealed themselves only in glimpses. The second night was worse. They barricaded themselves again inside the hotel room, dragging furniture against the door, huddling together under the weight of a lamp's dying glow. Outside, the whispers began sooner, not waiting for midnight but creeping in as dusk fell. They rose and fell like a tide, sometimes faint as breath on glass, sometimes booming so loudly the walls shook. The voices spoke their names now. Unmistakable. Sarah, drawn out, syllables stretching like torn cloth. Ethan, closer, almost inside the room. Lucas, whispered in tones not their own. Each name carried not just recognition but intimacy. The voices knew them. At one point, Sarah swore she saw hands pressing against the window pane from outside, pale against the glass, smearing it with condensation though the air was warm. Ethan didn't move to look. He couldn't. The whispers swelled to laughter, low, broken, human yet not human. It rose and fell, echoing down the empty streets, threading into the cracks of the building. The laughter did not fade until the first light of dawn painted the sky. When they stepped out in the morning, the hotel lobby had changed. The reception desk bore marks carved deep into its surface, long parallel scratches like talons dragged through wood. And behind the desk, where keys once hung neatly, there was only one left. Number 306, their room. Lucas ripped it from the wall, throwing it across the room as if burning his hand. It clattered against the floor, but when they looked again, it hung perfectly back in place, swaying gently as if mocking him. By now, panic began to erode rational thought. They didn't walk, they ran. Through the square, past the cafe, through streets that bent in ways they hadn't the day before. The town shifted, folding around them like a maze. That was when Ethan realized something impossible. The sun no longer moved. Morning bled into afternoon, but shadows didn't shift. The light was frozen, static, locked in perpetual brightness. The day was a cage, not a relief. Time here had stopped obeying the world outside. Sarah broke first. She collapsed onto the steps of the fountain, sobbing into her hands, her cries cutting jagged holes in the oppressive quiet. Lucas crouched beside her, gripping her shoulders, muttering frantic reassurances. Ethan stood apart, scanning the rooftops. And that's when he saw them. Not one silhouette this time. Dozens. Perched on the buildings, standing in doorways, stretching down alleys. Thin, black figures without detail, all turned toward the square. Their shapes flickered like heat waves, sometimes solid, sometimes translucent, but always there. Always watching. "Don't look," Ethan said, though his voice was broken, barely audible. Sarah lifted her head anyway. Her scream tore through the still air, shattering it like glass. The figures moved. Not with speed, but with intent. Slow, deliberate, closing in from every angle. The square that had once felt vast now tightened, the air compressing with each step of the shadows. Ethan felt it in his chest, pressure building like hands pressing down on his lungs. They ran again. Blindly, desperately, taking streets that twisted and folded, never knowing if they led closer to escape or deeper into the trap. The silhouettes didn't chase. They didn't need to. They only appeared ahead, waiting, always waiting. By the time the three of them stumbled back into the hotel, night had fallen again, though no hours had passed. The whispers rose immediately, a cacophony of voices layering over one another, filling the air like smoke. Lucas slammed the door shut, pressing his back against it, his chest heaving. Sarah curled on the bed, hands clamped over her ears. Ethan stood in the middle of the room, staring at the lamp as it flickered, shadows writhing across the walls in patterns that didn't match their bodies. And then he saw it. In the corner, darker than the rest of the room, stood a figure. Black, sharp, featureless. It hadn't been there a moment ago. This time, it didn't vanish. The figure in the corner was not a trick of the lamp. Its shape was too solid, too deliberate. Darkness bent around it, pooling as if the walls themselves recoiled from its presence. Ethan's throat closed as he tried to speak, but no sound came. His eyes watered, straining against the instinct to blink, terrified that if he did, it would move. Lucas followed his gaze. His expression shifted from confusion to terror in the span of a heartbeat. "Oh God," he muttered, the words almost swallowed by the heavy air. Sarah refused to look. She curled tighter into herself, whispering broken fragments of denial. The figure did not advance. It only stood, its head tilted in that unnatural way, as though curious. The shadows around its feet bled outward, spreading across the carpet in slow tendrils, creeping toward the bed. The lamp flickered violently. Ethan reached for it instinctively, gripping the base, holding it like a shield, as though its fragile glow could protect them. The light sputtered but did not die. And then, with a sound like air imploding, the figure was gone. The room fell silent again, but the silence was not relief. It was a threat, heavy and expectant, as though the city were holding its breath. No one spoke for a long time. Lucas finally broke it, his voice sharp, desperate. "We can't stay here. We can't. It's inside now. Do you get that? It's not just out there, it's in here." Sarah lifted her head, her eyes hollow. "Where do we go?" Lucas had no answer. Neither did Ethan. Because there was nowhere. The city folded upon itself endlessly. The hotel was a cage, but outside was worse. They didn't sleep. Not that night. They sat together, backs pressed against the wall, staring at the door, waiting. The whispers rose and fell like the tide, punctuated by bursts of laughter that seemed to echo inside their skulls. Ethan counted the seconds between them, but time no longer held shape. Minutes stretched, hours collapsed. When the next dawn arrived, pale and sour, they ventured out again. The square was unchanged, the fountain trickling, the table still set, as though the city mocked them with its stillness. But something had changed. On the broad glass window of the cafe, written in that same dripping black substance, were new words. "One will stay." Sarah gagged, clutching her stomach, tears welling in her eyes. Lucas stormed forward and smashed his fist against the glass. It didn't even crack. The words bled slowly downward, fresh, as though written moments before. They fled the sight, wandering aimlessly through streets that led them nowhere. Every turn seemed designed to corral them back toward the heart of the city. Every alley whispered with movement. Every shadow stretched too far. By evening, exhaustion broke through panic. They collapsed on the steps of an unfamiliar church, its doors yawning open. Inside, candles flickered though no hands had lit them. Pews stood orderly, hymnals resting neatly, a place frozen mid-service. They hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The air was cool, thick with dust and the faint scent of wax. It felt heavier than outside, as though the walls themselves bore witness. Lucas slumped against a pew, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We'll stay here tonight. It's better than that hotel." Ethan didn't argue. Neither did Sarah. They were beyond argument, beyond reason. As night fell, the candles burned lower, their flames bending against drafts that didn't exist. The whispers returned, filling the rafters, curling through the air like smoke. But this time, there was no laughter. Only chanting. But rhythmic. Ancient. Sarah clutched her head, rocking. Make it stop, please." Lucas pressed his hands against his ears, his jaw clenched tight. Ethan only stared at the altar. Because he could see them now, figures, rows of them, seated in the pews, indistinct shadows with no faces. Dozens, maybe hundreds, flickering in and out like afterimages burned onto his vision. He blinked hard, rubbed his eyes. They remained. And then one of them rose. The shadow drifted forward, soundless, its shape clearer than the rest. It reached the aisle, pausing, head tilting in that same way the figure in the hotel had. Ethan tried to shout to warn the others, but his voice broke. The shadow moved toward them. Lucas leapt to his feet, pulling Sarah behind him. "Stay back," he shouted into the emptiness. His voice echoed, cracking against the vaulted ceiling. The shadow did not stop. The candles flickered violently as it approached, their flames stretching away as though recoiling. Ethan stumbled backward, heart hammering against his ribs. It reached Lucas first. There was no impact, no struggle. The shadow simply enveloped him. One moment he was there, his face twisted in fury, his hands clenched into fists. The next, the blackness folded over him, swallowing him whole. His scream cut off almost instantly, leaving only silence. Sarah shrieked, collapsing onto the floor. Ethan grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. They burst into the night, the church behind them glowing faintly with unnatural light. The city greeted them with silence. The fountain trickled. The bus idled. The cafe tables remained untouched. But now there were only two. The night air pressed heavy against their skin as Ethan and Sarah stumbled away from the church. Their lungs burned, their legs trembled, but fear kept them moving. Behind them, the building loomed like a dark monument, its spire silhouetted against the sky that never truly turned black. The candles still burned within, though no wind should have allowed them. Lucas was gone. Not dead, not vanished, taken. Swallowed by the shadow as though his existence had been rewritten. Ethan could still see his face in the instant before it disappeared, twisted in rage and disbelief, a scream cut short as the blackness folded over him. Sarah's sobs broke the silence. They were sharp, uneven, each one rattling her chest. Ethan wanted to comfort her, but words felt useless. They were beyond reassurance, beyond rationality. He gripped her arm tightly instead, anchoring her to motion. If they stopped, they would break completely. The city stretched out endlessly, a labyrinth of stone and shadow. The streets no longer aligned. Buildings shifted subtly when they weren't looking, their windows blinking like watchful eyes. The fountain was no longer where it should have been. The cafe appeared on the wrong street corner. Each wrongness bent reality further, until even memory felt untrustworthy. They tried the main road again. At first, it seemed to promise escape, long, straight, leading toward the hills beyond. But after walking for what felt like hours, they found themselves back in the square. The bus still idled, its lights blinking faintly, the sound of its engine now warped, like breathing. Sarah froze. "It's playing with us," she whispered. Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. Because deep down, he knew she was right. That night, they refused the hotel. They chose a small grocery store instead, pushing shelves against the doors, curling up on the cold tile floor between aisles of untouched goods. The air smelled faintly of rot, though every package was sealed, pristine. Ethan held a bottle of water tightly in his hands, staring at his warped reflection in the plastic. The whispers came early. They slithered between the aisles, rising and falling, echoing off every surface. This time, the voices weren't just speaking names. They spoke memories. Sarah's voice from childhood, crying for her mother. Ethan's laughter as a boy, distorted and broken. Lucas's voice, screaming from somewhere deeper in the store, though they knew he was gone. Sarah covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "It knows us," she mouthed. "It knows everything." The lights flickered. One by one, the bulbs popped overhead, plunging the store into strips of shadow. Something moved in the darkness between the aisles, long, sharp, stretching. Ethan gripped Sarah's wrist. "Don't look," he whispered, though he knew it was useless. Her wide eyes darted anyway, drawn against her will. A figure stood at the end of the aisle. Tall, black, edges shimmering. It did not move, but its presence filled the space, pressing against them, suffocating. Sarah whimpered, curling against Ethan's side. Then, with a suddenness that made his heart seize, the figure leaned forward. Not a step, just a shift, its head jerking closer as though trying to push itself through the air. The shelves rattled. Cans tumbled to the floor, rolling across the tiles. Ethan dragged Sarah into the storage room, slamming the door, pressing his back against it. The whispers screamed now, louder, layers upon layers, until it was impossible to tell where they came from. Hours passed, or seconds. Time lost all meaning. When the whispers finally ebbed, leaving only the sound of their ragged breathing, Ethan dared to open the door again. The store was unchanged. Cans lay scattered, shelves still blocked the entrance. But the figure was gone. They didn't speak of it. They couldn't. By the next morning, the city had shifted again. Streets were narrower, the buildings taller, leaning inward as though conspiring. Windows stared down at them, their glass reflecting not light but shadows. They walked aimlessly, circling, trying not to look behind them. Then Sarah stopped. She stood frozen in the middle of the street, her gaze fixed ahead. Ethan followed her eyes. Lucas stood at the end of the road. He looked whole, unhurt, wearing the same clothes as the night before. His expression was blank, but his eyes were locked on them. "Lucas!" Sarah screamed, breaking into a run. Ethan lunged forward, grabbing her arm, pulling her back. "No, that's not him." But she fought against him, her face twisted in desperation. "It is. He's alive. We can bring him back." Lucas raised his hand, beckoning silently. His movements were slow, unnatural, as though pulled by invisible strings. Behind him, the shadows quivered, reaching out. Ethan held Sarah tighter, dragging her back step by step. "That's not him," he repeated, though his voice cracked, nearly breaking. Lucas tilted his head. And then his mouth opened, impossibly wide, stretching into blackness that consumed his face. From it spilled the whispers, thousands of voices, layered, screaming, chanting, laughing. Sarah collapsed into Ethan's arms, her body shaking violently. He dragged her away, refusing to look back. But the sound followed them, filling every corner of the city, bleeding into their ears until they could no longer tell if it came from outside or inside their own skulls. By nightfall, they found themselves at the fountain again. This time, the water was no longer clear. It was black, thick, swirling slowly like tar. Reflections shifted on its surface, faces they knew, faces they didn't, all screaming silently. Sarah broke then. Her mind slipped, her sobs turning to laughter, hysterical and sharp. She stumbled to the fountain, dipping her hands into the black water, pulling them back coated in ink-like liquid. "It's calling us," she whispered, smiling through tears. "It wants us." Ethan pulled her away, his own sanity fraying at the edges. His body ached with exhaustion, his mind split between terror and numbness. The city had stripped them down to raw nerves, and still it wasn't finished. That night, as they hid again in the hotel, Ethan woke to find Sarah standing at the window. Her face was blank, her eyes unblinking, and in the reflection of the glass, a figure stood directly behind her. The glass reflected what Ethan's mind could barely process. Sarah stood at the window, her body rigid, her face devoid of expression. Behind her loomed the silhouette, its form tall and impossibly thin, edges wavering like smoke, yet darker than any shadow could be. It did not touch her, but its presence enveloped her entirely, as though it had already claimed her. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He tried to speak, but his voice refused him. All he could do was stagger forward, reaching for her shoulder. The moment his hand brushed her skin, Sarah blinked, slow and mechanical, and her lips parted. The sound that came out was not hers. It was layered, fractured, a chorus of voices spilling through her mouth, male and female, young and old, laughter, sobs, screams, all at once. Ethan stumbled back, horrified. Her head turned toward him with a motion too sharp, too sudden. Her eyes were no longer her own. They shimmered black, reflecting nothing but void. "You cannot keep her," the voices hissed through her, vibrating the glass, shaking the walls. Ethan shook his head violently. "No. She's mine. She's Sarah. You can't." His own words broke into ragged sobs. Sarah, or what was left of her, took a step forward. The silhouette behind her moved in perfect synchronicity, like a puppet and puppeteer, though the strings were unseen. She reached for him, her hand trembling, her lips twitching as though a fragment of her still fought within. For an instant, Ethan thought he saw her real eyes flash through the black. "Help me," she whispered, a single human note piercing through the chorus. And then she screamed. The window shattered outward, glass exploding into the night. The figure pulled her through the frame as easily as breath escaping lungs. One moment she was there, the next she was gone, her scream swallowed by the city's endless silence. Ethan was left alone. He collapsed to his knees, clutching the shards of glass in his hands until blood ran down his arms. His cries echoed through the empty hotel room, unanswered, unwanted. For hours he sat in the dark, his mind a storm of grief and terror. He had seen Lucas consumed, and now Sarah, both taken, both erased. He was the last, and the city was patient. When dawn came, it did not bring light. The sky remained gray, heavy, the kind of light that offered no warmth, no comfort. Ethan stumbled out of the hotel, his body stiff, his face hollow. The streets were quieter than ever. Shops still stood open, their goods untouched. The bus still idled at the square, though its shape seemed warped now, bent at strange angles when viewed from the corner of his eye. He refused to approach it. He wandered aimlessly, every footstep an echo in the void. His ears strained constantly, waiting for whispers, for movement, for any sign that he was not entirely abandoned. He almost wished for the shadow to appear, at least then he would not be alone. But the city had changed its tactics. Now it worked through silence, through emptiness. Every building he passed seemed to lean inward, listening. Every window reflected his movements, though sometimes his reflection did not match. Once, he saw himself standing still when he was walking. Another time, his reflection smiled when he did not. He stopped looking into windows. The hours bled together. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but the thought of eating from the untouched shops repulsed him. The food seemed poisoned, not by substance but by intent. The city wanted him to eat, to drink, to sustain himself so it could play longer. So he starved. By the second night alone, Ethan's mind began to fracture. He spoke aloud to himself just to break the silence, whispering Sarah's name, Lucas's name, his own. Sometimes he thought he heard an answer. Sometimes he did. Laughter echoed from alleyways. Not loud, not close, just enough to keep him moving. Whispers slithered through the air when he tried to rest, curling into his ears, replaying his worst memories. His father's disappointment. His mother's crying. Sarah's scream as she was pulled away. Sleep was impossible. He found himself at the fountain again. The water was thicker now, blacker, bubbling faintly as though it boiled without heat. Faces surfaced briefly, then sank again. Lucas, Sarah, strangers. And always, they looked at him. He sat at the fountain's edge, staring into the swirling abyss. His reflection was there, but distorted. His mouth wider, his eyes darker, his skin cracked like old porcelain. The reflection smiled. Ethan recoiled, but the smile remained. And then the reflection spoke, its lips moving silently, whispering words he could not hear but could somehow understand. It told him the truth. There had never been an escape. The city had never been a place he entered. It was a place he was brought to. Chosen. The others were distractions, fuel, stepping stones to weaken his resolve. He was the true focus. He was the prey the city wanted to savor the most. The shadow did not need to chase him. It needed him to break himself. And it was working. Ethan staggered away from the fountain, his mind spinning. He knew the city was bending him, shaping him. He no longer trusted what he saw, what he heard, what he felt. His own thoughts were suspect, rewritten by whispers he could not stop. That night, he climbed to the roof of a tall building, hoping to see beyond the city, to glimpse the hills or the sea or anything that promised escape. But from above, the city stretched infinitely in every direction. Streets spiraled into impossible patterns, buildings shifted as he watched, whole districts rearranging themselves like pieces on a board. There was no edge, no boundary, only endless, silent streets. Ethan collapsed onto the rooftop, weeping. The sound was swallowed instantly, leaving nothing but silence. And then he felt it. The shadow was behind him. He did not turn. He did not need to. Its presence filled the space, pressing against his back, colder than death. He knew that if he looked, it would take him instantly. Instead, he whispered into the night, his voice breaking. "Please, let it end." The city answered with silence. The shadow did not move. It waited, patient, eternal, because it knew what Ethan would eventually do. It didn't need to take him. He would give himself willingly. The rooftops offered no escape. Only endless rows of silent buildings, their geometry shifting beneath the foggy dawn. From above, the streets formed spirals and labyrinths, patterns that hurt to stare at too long, shapes that bent inward as though the entire city were folding around him. Ethan pressed his face into his hands, trembling, refusing to believe what his eyes insisted. There was no world beyond this. No countryside, no ocean, no roads leading outward. Only the city. He descended the building slowly, gripping the stairwell rail as if it alone tethered him to reality. Every shadow along the walls seemed deeper than it should, and more than once he felt something brush against him in the dark, though the stairwell was empty. At the bottom, the lobby greeted him with the same stillness that had become unbearable. The reception desk sat abandoned, a phone resting there as if waiting. He approached it. His hands shook as he lifted the receiver, pressing it to his ear. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. Then came the faintest whisper, his own voice, speaking words he hadn't yet said. "Hello," he whispered. "Hello," his voice answered instantly, perfectly mirrored. The receiver slipped from his hands, clattering against the desk. He stumbled backward, his chest heaving, bile rising in his throat. The city was no longer content to steal his friends. It wanted him to hear himself unravel. Outside, the streets had changed again. The square with the fountain no longer lay where it should. Instead, narrow alleys twisted into each other, converging on a street lined with mannequins behind shattered glass storefronts. They wore clothing frozen in the latest fashions, but their faces were smudged, featureless. Ethan felt their blank gazes follow him as he walked. When he passed one, its head tilted slightly, just enough for him to notice. His breath caught. He began to move faster. Another mannequin turned its body. Another raised its hand. By the time he was halfway down the street, every figure in every window had shifted, watching. He broke into a sprint. The sound of glass shattering followed him, mannequins tumbling into the street, their limbs cracking, scraping against the pavement as they crawled after him. Their faceless heads swiveled, jointed arms twitching like insects. He didn't dare look back for long, but he could hear the clatter of limbs against stone, the scrape of broken glass dragged across the ground. When he finally collapsed into another building, slamming the door shut, silence fell instantly. The mannequins were gone, as though they had never existed. Ethan leaned against the wall, gasping for air, his heart hammering. His body ached with exhaustion, his skin slick with sweat. He no longer trusted his own senses. The city blurred reality and nightmare so seamlessly that he couldn't distinguish between them. And maybe that was the point. The building he had entered seemed to be an apartment complex. Hallways stretched longer than they should, lined with doors that all looked identical. He forced himself forward, dragging his hand along the peeling wallpaper as if to remind himself he was still tethered to something physical. Halfway down the corridor, he heard it. A knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks from behind one of the doors. Ethan froze. His throat constricted, his mind screamed at him to move, to run, but his body was paralyzed. The knock came again, louder this time, echoing down the hallway. His breath came in ragged bursts. He stumbled backward, his shoulder hitting the opposite wall. Then from behind every door, the knocking began. A chorus of fists pounding in unison, shaking the walls, rattling the floor. He covered his ears, tears streaming down his face as the noise rose to a deafening rhythm, like a heartbeat amplified through the entire building. And then silence. Every door clicked open at once. Darkness spilled out from the rooms, flooding the hallway like smoke, thick and suffocating. Within it, shapes moved, too many, too large. Shadows bent themselves into human-like forms, limbs stretching, jaws opening in soundless screams. Ethan ran. He bolted through the hall, through stairwells, through collapsing corridors that twisted and shrank around him. The shadows followed, not in haste but with inevitability, consuming every corner, filling every space. At last he burst into the street, collapsing onto the cobblestones, his chest heaving. The air outside was no better. He could still feel the city watching, the silence pressing against his ears. Somewhere, faintly, he heard Sarah's voice. "Ethan." It was soft, pleading, the way she used to call him in the quiet of the night. His body jolted with recognition, his heart lurching. He turned toward the sound, eyes wide, searching. There she was, at the far end of the street, her figure illuminated by a single flickering streetlight. She looked whole, her face pale but her eyes clear. She raised her hand to him. "Come to me," she whispered. Ethan staggered to his feet, tears burning his eyes. His mind screamed that it was a trap, that nothing in this place was what it seemed. But his heart betrayed him. He took a step forward. The light flickered, and for a fraction of a second, her face twisted. Her eyes darkened, her mouth split too wide, and the shadow loomed behind her. Then the light returned, and she looked normal again. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't leave me." Ethan's knees buckled. He pressed his hands to his face, torn between running and surrendering. He could no longer tell if he was resisting the city or resisting himself. When he opened his eyes again, the street was empty. She was gone. Only the silence remained. Ethan collapsed against the wall of the nearest building, his sobs echoing through the hollow city. His body was broken, his spirit frayed. He understood now what the city wanted, Not just his body, but his despair. His hopelessness was its feast. And Ethan was almost ready to give it what it wanted. The silence became heavier with each passing hour, until it felt like a weight pressing down on Ethan's chest. It was no longer absence of sound. It was a presence in itself, alive, deliberate, suffocating. He had once feared the whispers, but now he longed for them, because at least they had been proof of something beyond his own spiraling mind. The streets warped further as the days, if they could still be called days, bled together. The sky never changed. It hung in its gray stillness, neither night nor morning, never offering clarity, never offering relief. Ethan wandered through alleys that folded into themselves, doors that opened onto walls, staircases that led downward only to deposit him where he had begun. The city was not a prison. It was a maze that reshaped itself with each breath, designed not to trap but to erode. And Ethan was eroding. His body weakened from hunger. His lips cracked, his legs trembled, his vision blurred with spots of black. But worse was the mind. He could feel it thinning, unraveling, peeling away layer by layer. Every memory he had, his childhood, his family, Sarah's laugh, Lucas's smirk, slipped from his grasp the more he tried to hold them. By the third night without sleep, he began to hear Sarah constantly. Not just a fleeting echo, but a steady presence at his side. Her voice whispered into his ear as he stumbled through the empty avenues. Sometimes she pleaded with him to find her, sometimes she begged him to end it, and sometimes she laughed with a cruelty that did not belong to her at all. He tried to block her out, but she was everywhere. Reflected in shop windows. Standing at the end of every hall. Appearing behind him in puddles of black water that gathered in the gutters. Always gone when he blinked, but always returning again. Once, he reached out to her reflection. His hand touched the glass, and for an instant, another hand pressed back against his. It was ice cold, and the skin cracked like porcelain under his touch. He recoiled, falling backward, his heart hammering as the reflection split into dozens of faces, all Sarah, all screaming silently. The city fed on this. He knew it. He felt it. Every sob, every panic, every collapse only deepened its hunger. He began talking to himself just to fill the air, his voice broken and hoarse. "You won't have me," he muttered. "You won't take me. I'm still here. I'm still me." But the city answered. It mocked him with echoes, his own voice returning from alleys and corridors, repeating his words with twisted inflections. "You won't have me. Won't have me, have me." The repetitions grew louder, harsher, until they sounded like snarls, until they became a chant pounding against his skull. He clutched his head, falling to his knees, screaming into the void. His scream carried no distance. It was devoured instantly, leaving the silence untouched. That night he sought refuge in the library. The building rose tall, its stone facade cracked but intact, its windows dark. Inside, rows of books stood waiting, untouched, endless. Dust coated every surface, though there were no signs of time here. Ethan staggered between the shelves, running his hands over the spines. The titles blurred as he read them, words twisting, letters rearranging. Sometimes they formed phrases he knew, his own name, Sarah's name, Lucas's. Other times they shaped horrors he could not bear to read aloud. He pulled one book free. The pages inside were blank, except for a single line scrawled across the center. "You are the last." The book fell from his hands. From somewhere deeper in the library, the sound of pages turning filled the air. Slow, deliberate, though no wind stirred. Ethan froze, listening. The sound grew louder, spreading through the aisles, as if every book in the building were opening at once. And then came the whispers. They poured from the shelves, countless voices reading countless passages in unison, creating a cacophony of words that scraped his mind raw. He covered his ears, but the voices were inside him, vibrating in his skull, filling his veins. He stumbled through the aisles, desperate to escape, but the rows stretched longer, bending away, looping back upon themselves. Everywhere he turned, the shelves followed. The library had no end. He ran until his legs gave out. Collapsing onto the floor, he gasped for air, staring at the ceiling that pulsed like a living thing. From above, shadows seeped downward, curling along the walls, reaching with long, skeletal fingers. The books began to fall, one by one, tumbling from the shelves as though thrown. Pages tore free, swirling into the air, slashing at his skin like knives. Words etched themselves onto his arms, black letters searing into his flesh. He screamed, clawing at them, but they only spread further. And then, all at once, it stopped. The pages fluttered to the floor. The shelves stood still. The shadows receded. Ethan lay trembling, his arms covered in bleeding scratches, words carved into his skin. He dared not read them. He dared not know what story the city had written into his body. Crawling out of the library took every last ounce of strength. When he finally emerged onto the street, the gray sky pressed down heavier than ever. He stumbled forward, broken, his legs threatening to give way. At the end of the road he saw the fountain again. Only now, the black water had risen, overflowing onto the cobblestones. It spread slowly, crawling down the streets like veins of tar. Within it, faces churned, Lucas, Sarah, strangers, and reflections of himself, all screaming silently. Ethan fell to his knees before it, tears streaming down his face. "I can't," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can't anymore." The shadow appeared behind him. It did not strike. It did not reach. It only stood, towering, inevitable, waiting. Because the city no longer needed to hunt him. Ethan was breaking himself. And soon he would offer his life willingly. The city was inside him now. Ethan felt it pulsing beneath his skin, whispering in his blood. Every step he took echoed too loudly, as if the cobblestones were hollow, as though he walked on the chest of something vast and alive. He no longer asked where he was going. There was no destination. There was only wandering, only survival stretched thin across hours that never ended. The gray sky pressed lower, suffocating, like the lid of a coffin that would never open. Buildings leaned closer, their windows gaping like open mouths, their shadows pooling toward him wherever he stood. Sometimes, in the corner of his vision, he swore he saw the walls breathing, slow, steady, in rhythm with his own lungs. His hunger had become a dull ache, his thirst a dry crack in his throat. But what gnawed at him most was memory. He tried to recall Sarah's smile, Lucas's voice, the sound of his own laughter, and found nothing but static. Their faces were smeared, blurred, like water-damaged photographs. Even his own name slipped away, syllables dissolving before he could form them. The city was eating his identity. One night, if night it could be called, he found himself back at the hotel. The doors gaped open, the lobby silent. He moved through it like a ghost retracing his own steps. Upstairs, the window Sarah had been taken through still gaped, shards of glass scattered like frozen tears on the floor. He knelt before it, touching one of the shards. In the reflection of the broken glass, Sarah's face looked back at him. Her lips moved soundlessly, her eyes pleading. He pressed his hand to the shard. His reflection pressed back, but it was not his. It was Sarah's hand, cold, cracked, dripping black water. Ethan screamed, flinging the shard away, clutching his hand as though it burned. The glass clattered across the floor, spinning, humming with a resonance that did not fade. The sound filled the room, vibrating through the walls, until the entire building seemed to hum in sympathy. And then from every room, every hallway, every shadow, voices answered. They called his name. Not Sarah, not Lucas, his. They chanted it in unison, 1,000 voices layered together, rising and falling like the tide. He clamped his hands over his ears, but the sound came from within. His skull throbbed with it, his teeth aching, his bones vibrating. He staggered into the hallway, collapsing against the wall. The doors along the corridor swung open one by one, revealing only blackness inside. From that blackness, figures stepped forward, shadows molded into human shapes, tall, thin, featureless. Dozens of them, filling the hall, moving in perfect silence. Ethan scrambled backward, but the hall stretched endlessly, the figures advancing with synchronized steps. Their presence pressed against him, suffocating, erasing. He turned and bolted down the stairwell, the pounding of his own footsteps swallowed instantly by the city's silence. Outside, the streets had transformed again. They were narrower, claustrophobic, bending inward like ribs around a cage. The sky was darker now, not gray but black, though no stars pierced it. The fountain no longer bubbled. It towered, risen high like an obsidian pillar, its black water spilling in torrents across the city, flooding the streets. Ethan waded through the water, its coldness biting deep, its thickness clinging like oil. Faces swam in it, brushing against his legs, whispering through bubbles. He tried not to look, but each step forced him deeper into the black tide. When he reached the square, he saw them. Sarah and Lucas stood there, side by side, perfectly still. Their faces were pale, their eyes void, their mouths stretched into wide, unnatural smiles. "Join us," Sarah whispered, though her lips did not move. "Join us," Lucas echoed, his voice hollow, vibrating through Ethan's bones. Ethan shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. "You're not real. You're not." But his words faltered, because part of him wanted to believe. Part of him longed to step forward, to let the city take him, to end the suffering. They reached out their hands. Their fingers were long, blackened, dripping with the same liquid that flooded the streets. "Join us," they repeated. Ethan stumbled backward, choking on sobs, shaking his head until his vision blurred. "No, no, no." The shadows rose behind them, swelling higher, stretching wider, until they blotted out the streets entirely. The city itself was taking form, coalescing into a single towering silhouette that bent over him like the sky itself. Its edges bled into the darkness, its face absent, yet Ethan felt its gaze pierce every fiber of his being. He fell to his knees. His body no longer responded to will, it was heavy, exhausted, broken. His mind teetered on the edge, a thread about to snap. The voices thundered now, louder than ever, shaking the ground, rattling his bones. "You are the last." The water rose around him, swallowing his chest, climbing toward his mouth. He gasped for air, but the black liquid filled his throat, searing, burning, drowning. Faces pressed against his skin, their mouths open in endless screams, their hands clawing at him as though desperate to drag him down. Ethan thrashed, his cries muffled by the flood. His vision blurred, his lungs screamed. And then, silence. The water stilled. The voices stopped. Ethan was lying on dry cobblestones. No water, no shadows, no figures. The square was empty again, as though nothing had happened. But he knew better. The city wasn't tormenting him anymore. It was waiting for him to make the final choice. Ethan walked, though he no longer knew why. His body moved because it must, not because he willed it. The streets guided him like invisible hands, nudging him left, turning him right, pulling him forward into places that were both familiar and strange. He had passed this alley before, he was certain of it, yet the graffiti was different now, warped into jagged letters that spelled nothing he understood. The silence pressed harder than ever. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the suppression of it. Every breath he took felt stolen, muffled by the air itself, as though the city resented even the smallest disturbance. His heartbeat seemed treacherously loud, thudding in his ears like footsteps of something following him. At times he thought he heard Lucas behind him, calling his name in that broken, hollow voice. Other times it was Sarah, whispering comfort, begging him to stop running. He tried not to listen, but the voices wrapped around him like tendrils, threading into his mind until he couldn't tell what was memory and what was invention. Hours, maybe days, passed like this. Hunger gnawed at him but gave no strength to move faster. Thirst burned his throat, yet every fountain he passed spewed only that same black liquid, thick and stinking of decay. His body shriveled, his spirit splintered. He wasn't sure he had long left. The city seemed to sense his fragility. At first, it taunted him with glimpses of normalcy. A light flickered in an apartment window above him, casting a warm glow. A shadow moved inside, someone alive, someone real. Ethan staggered forward, pounding at the building's locked door. "Please, please let me in." The light went out. Silence reclaimed everything. The second trick was crueler. On one street he turned a corner and saw people, dozens of them, walking as though nothing was wrong. Couples holding hands, children running, an old man reading a newspaper on a bench. Relief overwhelmed him. He sprinted forward, shouting until his throat cracked. "I'm here! Please help me!" None of them looked at him. He ran into the crowd, reaching for a woman's arm. His hand passed straight through her. The figures dissolved into ash, scattered on a wind that did not exist. Ethan fell to his knees, sobbing. His tears burned his skin. But the cruelest trick of all came when he turned back toward the hotel. He swore he wouldn't, but his feet betrayed him, leading him there again as though the city knew he would always return. This time, when he entered the lobby, Sarah and Lucas stood waiting. Not as shadows. Not as husks. As themselves. Sarah smiled gently, her eyes warm and wet with tears. Lucas clapped a hand on Ethan's shoulder, firm, grounding. "We're here," he said. "We never left. It's been the city playing with you." For a single, fragile moment, Ethan believed. He wanted to believe. He collapsed into Sarah's arms, inhaling the scent of her hair, clutching her as if to anchor himself. Lucas's presence steadied him, reminded him of who he was, of who they all had been. And then Sarah whispered, "Join us." Her lips stretched too wide. Her eyes turned black. Lucas's grip tightened until Ethan screamed, bones grinding under the pressure. Their skin rippled like water, their forms twisting back into shadows that clawed at his body. He tore himself free, falling backward into the glass of the reception desk, shattering it in a rain of shards. Blood spilled down his arm, but he didn't feel it anymore. Pain had become meaningless. He staggered outside again, but the city had shifted. The streets no longer sprawled outward in a labyrinth. They funneled inward, spiraling toward the center. Buildings loomed higher, warped into impossible angles, leaning inward to form a jagged crown above him. The sky, once an endless gray, had constricted into a small circle of dim light directly above the square. The city was closing. And in its heart, he saw the shadow. It stood impossibly tall, its head brushing the crown of leaning buildings, its body bleeding into every wall, every street, every surface. It was not in the city, it was the city. Windows were its eyes, alleys its ribs, the streets its veins. The black liquid poured from it ceaselessly, flooding everything, carrying with it the screams of all it had consumed. Ethan fell to his knees, his mind fracturing under the weight of revelation. There was no escape. There never had been. The city had drawn them here, played with them, devoured them. And now it wanted him. The shadow bent low, its formless face inches above him. "You are mine," it said, not in words, but in thought, a thunderous vibration that rattled his bones and tore at his sanity. Ethan's body convulsed. His vision blurred. His soul trembled on the edge of breaking. He realized then that death was not the worst fate. Death was mercy. The worst fate was to stay. To dissolve into the silence. To become another whisper in the chorus. And Ethan knew what he had to do. His trembling hands searched his body, his pockets, the debris scattered around him. A shard of glass, sharp and glinting faintly in the dim light, found its way into his grip. He held it close, pressing it against his chest. The shadow leaned closer. Ethan raised his eyes one last time. "You won't take me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Not like them." And with that, he pressed the shard deep into his heart. The world shattered. The silence broke. The city screamed. For an instant, there was nothing. No pain, no fear, no sound. Ethan floated in an endless, colorless void, lighter than air, freer than he had felt since the nightmare began. His body lay behind him like an abandoned husk, irrelevant. At last, he thought, the silence had been broken. He had escaped. But escape was only an illusion. The void began to ripple, slow at first, then violently. The silence he had pierced returned, louder, heavier, until it crushed him from every side. His relief twisted into dread as he realized he was still there, not in his body, but not gone either. The city had not let him leave. His eyes opened. He was back in the square, his body collapsed on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. The shards still jutted from his chest, though the wound no longer bled. He tried to scream, but no voice came. His throat moved, his lips shaped words, but sound no longer belonged to him. He rose. His movements were unnatural, stiff, as though pulled by invisible strings. His shadow stretched outward, merging seamlessly with the black liquid that coated the streets. Every step he took echoed not as one, but as many, hundreds of overlapping footsteps trailing behind him, layered in endless chorus. Around him, the city stirred. Windows flared with sudden light, but behind the glass were no rooms, only faces. Dozens, then hundreds, pressing against the panes, mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes locked on him, following every step. Some faces he recognized. Sarah, Lucas, strangers glimpsed in fleeting hallucinations. Others were older, weathered, distorted, people who had lived and died long before. He tried to turn away, to resist, but there was no choice left. His body was not his own. The city guided him now, threading its will through every nerve. He stumbled through the spiraling streets, drawn inward toward the square's center. The black shadow loomed above, larger than any building, a tower of shifting form that stretched into the choking sky. And it welcomed him. The chorus of whispers swelled, finally audible, voices layered and endless. One more. One more. One more. The chant echoed through his skull until thought itself broke apart. He fell to his knees, clutching his head, but the hands that gripped his hair were not his own. They were pale, elongated, belonging to the black figures that encircled him. The silhouettes had returned. Dozens now, maybe hundreds, crowding the square, closing in, their bodies indistinct yet solid enough to hold him down. Faces flickered across their surfaces, Sarah's, Lucas's, his own. He realized with sudden horror that these were not specters, not illusions. They were the people who had come before, consumed and reshaped, stripped of will, bound to serve. One by one, the shadows pressed their hands against him. Cold seeped through his skin, deeper than bone, into the core of him. His heartbeat slowed, faltered, and then stopped altogether. Yet he did not fall. He remained standing, propped by the hands of the legion around him. And then he felt it, the transformation. His skin darkened, not bruised, but hollowed, drained of color until it matched the blackness of those who held him. His eyes sank into pits of shadow. His voice, his last remaining proof of self, dissolved into the chorus, absorbed without echo. He was no longer Ethan. He was silence. The city exhaled, satisfied. The streets stilled. The windows dimmed. The black liquid receded, absorbed into the cracks of the pavement. The spiral crown of buildings relaxed, straightening as though the ritual was complete. Ethan's body, what little remained of it, stood motionless in the square. Around him, the other shadows melted back into the walls, the alleys, the very fabric of the city. Only one remained visible, tall and alone, standing where he had fallen. It did not move. It did not breathe. But it watched. Always watched. And then the city slept again. Until the next visitor came.